Hello and welcome to Acadian Driftwood. My name is Kyle Mack. I'm joined with my co-host Kendall Cotton, and we haven't gotten a chance to really chat in a while. How are you doing, buddy? We're almost out of quarantine. Maybe.
Almost out, the sun's shining. It's the fog's lifting off the coronavirus. I think people are ready to get back to normal.
Yeah, hopefully things end up going back to normal. I know we're supposed to be here in Montana. We're supposed to be going to at least phase one of normalcy starting next week, right?
Yeah. It sounds like they're starting to open things back up. I guess I'm still working from home for the time being. I haven't gotten any direction there, but I'm assuming any day I'll probably be able to finally leave my apartment and go back to normal work schedule.
Yeah,
Which will
hopefully.
be weird.
Hopefully. I work from right here, so my life still remains relatively unchanged. Um, but yeah, anyways, we were chatting a bit offline before doing all this, and you had sent me something the other day. You sent me kind of a fun little list that you made up of the different types of people that you see during a pandemic, and the different types of people you see like online, you see on the news, you see everywhere, and how people have reacted to this. And you boiled it down to six categories, right?
Yeah, and just to be clear, six stereotypes. So not
Stereotypes
necessarily.
completely, yeah.
Yeah, this isn't categorical. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are in different places in this, but I think that the stereotypes are very clear, and you kind of see some of these people in social media and just in your day-to-day life during this pandemic.
Yeah, and because I've always had, this is probably going to be a bit of over psychologizing it, this phenomenon, but both of us have a pretty strong interest in psychology. I've been interested in it for a long time, for like a decade, and
Yeah.
you've gotten pretty interested over the last few years with the rise of people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt, and we're both big fans of Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, and
Yes.
kind of what this is and what you're trying to do with this list that we're going to kind of showcase, I guess, is kind of tackling Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, where showing how different people react based off of their moral inclinations that people just kind of
Right.
naturally have. And it brings people into it's a very easy predictor of seeing people's their politics, how they're going to respond to a given event, something like this. It's, I think, where a lot of memes come out of, things like the Karen meme, which is the Karens are the first on your list. Um,
Well, and
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. Well, I was just going to say, and I think what's really interesting about the moral foundations theory, and if you haven't read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, I highly recommend it because it really changed the way that I think about politics and the way that I view people who have different opinions than me. And when we view these stereotypes, some of them have a negative connotation. Actually, probably all of them have a negative
Mhm.
connotation, at least in what we drew up. But I think it's important for readers who are viewing this through a moral foundations, or listeners who are viewing this through a moral foundation lens, to remember that the stereotypes here are operating off of a psychology and a view of morality, and so their view of what's right and wrong is much different than potentially someone else's view, and so they're not necessarily less wrong or less right or more wrong than anybody else. So I think it's important for us to just remember these are just different ways of coming at situations based upon your own psychology.
Yeah, and I believe that the subtitle of The Righteous Mind is Why Good People Are Divided by Religion and Politics.
Right.
And that's a very useful way of looking at it. Of a lot of people kind of go about this with good intentions, but they're often talking past each other because they have different values of what good and bad are, of what right and wrong
Right.
are.
Yeah.
And some of these things are very subjective when it comes to interpersonal interactions. And That's one of the big things is the way that Jonathan Haidt does it is he categorizes different moral foundations into what are the your views on care and harm, your views on loyalty, your views on authority, your views on fairness and equality, your views on sanctity and purity. Those are kind of the five major ones. He's also included liberty and oppression to appease the annoying libertarians like myself. But those are kind of, and people kind of find themselves filtered in those categories and how they view the world. And obviously, a lot of this is theoretical, but I think there's merit to it.
And when you say like how you view the world, this is how you kind of define what's right and wrong. And to be clear, this isn't right and wrong like making a determination about what's the the best financial decision here or something like that. This is like right and wrong of like what's morally right and wrong. So what's morally good or bad. And just to add on to what Kyle said, so to clarify for our viewers the different moral foundations here. So the care harm foundation is generally kind of this instinct to protect others. The fairness and equality foundation is this instinct to punish cheaters and to protect kind of the equalization of the situation.
Well, and making everything kind of a fair playing ground, like, and there's a lot of things to do with like reciprocity, like you kind of like depending on your perspective of how you look at it, it could just be like trying to share everything across the board, or it could be more so like you get what you deserve. And I know, and Jonathan Haidt makes a distinction of that, of both like liberals and conservatives. They kind of view fairness in a different way, and I think that's an important distinction.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, Kyle. And so then loyalty, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little later because of my own foundations. So the loyalty foundation is interesting. So that's feeling of ties to your team. So that's kind of like where people get a sense of patriotism or nationalism, or this idea that you have a responsibility to others that you kind of identify in your group. The authority foundation is interesting. So that's kind of this instinct to know when to obey. So that's a really, kind of stark understanding of leaders and followers, and, what is good and bad, morally good and bad actions in the sense of being a leader and being a follower, and when to do both.
And on top of that, it's also like your inclinations towards tradition.
That's a good point.
If there's traditions that are kind of set in place in your society, it's going to be like, are you following those traditions or are you not? Like those are going to be deterministic in your mindset of whether or not a person is doing good or bad actions in that manner.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And it's basically like following rules and your view of when rules are okay to be broken and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you can maybe even see it like an order versus chaos dynamic. You could probably see it a little bit in that.
Yeah. And then purity. Purity is really interesting. And there's tests that we'll link to after this podcast is over for you to take. But purity is really interesting because this involves the instinct of disgust for revolting things. And a lot of it surrounds kind of our evolutionary makeup, where, we evolved to be sensitive to things that are harmful to, biologically. So like dirty things or, things that are, rotten and that sort of thing. But it bleeds
taboos
over in politics.
Yeah, a lot of taboos too.
That's right.
The way that Jonathan Haidt kind of starts off in his book, if I remember, which is, I read it like 2 years ago, so it's been a while, kind of refreshing my brain as I'm talking about it, where he talks about how different cultures have different food taboos, and people have different disgust preferences in regards to that, how people view different acts between individuals, like all those things. Like if you get that inherent, like, that disgust mechanism that comes in it, like that's this moral foundation. Anything that kind of gives you that, like I just feel uncomfortable with this.
Right. A good example of that is the different cultures' views on greetings. So, shaking with your right hand, is kind of the custom for Western people. And that's a lot different in, say the, Indian and like Southeast Asia cultures, because they view, your hand as something that you use as a tool for a lot of, what they view as kind of taboo acts, like eating and cleaning and things like that. So there's just a big difference between how people view things, and that bleeds over into politics a lot.
Yeah, and then the sixth one, which isn't on the test that we took, because we both took this test a while back, and we're kind of reviewing it right now as we're going through this list. The sixth one is liberty versus oppression, which is the classic, like, you know, stance on government, stance on individuals versus like oppressive figures, stance on like that type of morality, which libertarians like myself and you as well are often kind of autistic when it comes to this moral foundation, I would say.
Yeah, typically it really clashes too with the authority foundation, because liberty and oppression is very sensitive to people who like, I guess we view as unfairly oppressed, and as not able to do what they want to do safely and peacefully because of an authority figure.
I don't know if it has to inherently clash with the authority foundation, because authority is also like how you view hierarchy. And because I have negative views on government as a whole, that doesn't necessarily mean that I think hierarchies are bad. I'm right wing in that perspective on hierarchies, where I think hierarchies are inherently natural in human beings. I just kind of think that like state control and like governments, they end up creating like a faux hierarchy. Like it's not like it's like a it's like a bastardization of like natural hierarchical phenomenon.
Well, that's what government is, right? It's a monopoly. It's a monopoly of hierarchy or monopoly of force, and it's not necessarily something that's consensual, and it's instituted by force, and so therefore it's not necessarily it's arbitrary, and it's not necessarily representative of values and norms and that sort of thing.
Well, and that's actually probably the best distinction of the liberty oppression matrix is it's about your views on coercion. It's about force. It's not necessarily about like hierarchical having leaders. It's about like if it's like an oppressive dictatorship.
Right. It's unconsensual.
Yes. Yeah. We're libertarians are all about consent.
So yeah, on that, I mean, Kyle, why don't you pull up our moral foundations so we can kind of go through them, and maybe that'll give our viewers a little bit more perspective on where we come at political issues.
Yes. Let me get this. Yeah. So here's mine. The way that this graph is set up, the green is how I scored on the test. And I took this test like 2 years ago, so some of these things could be different. But the blue bar is people that self-describe themselves as liberal, and the red bar is people that self-describe themselves as conservative. So on my end here, I'm lower than both of those, which would be probably expected of most libertarians. Care Harm Foundation. This is the bleeding heart, feel good stuff. It's often very people that are singularly minded in this are usually of like the utilitarian perspective, where it's like trying to maximize the most amount of good and reduce the most amount of harm. That's kind of like how they see the world.
But to be fair too, it's also the kind of fundamental foundation of Western society. I mean, this is so a ton of people who take this test who are in kind of the Western culture will score high on the Care Harm matrix.
Is that true? I don't know.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it really is a fundamental foundation of kind of the Western way of thinking, where it's this idea of you're free to pursue your version of happiness as long as you don't harm anybody else. So that's really kind of a fundamental way that Western cultures view things.
I guess I could see that. I don't know. I'm kind of mixed on that statement, but yeah. So I'm lower than average on everybody on that. My fairness is the one that's extremely low. This is my views on things like equality, egalitarianism. I'm very much not an egalitarian, like philosophically. Like I very much believe that there's like inherent, like people have different inherent values. They like, and this is like a natural state of the world. Is it great? Does it cause a lot of suffering? Yeah, like yes, of course, there's a lot of suffering that's caused by this, but it's kind of a natural phenomenon that exists, and I don't go super out of my way to try to fix that. It's not something that's like necessarily at the forefront of my brain. I'm much more concerned with other elements of morality, just naturally.
Right. So Kyle, so in that sense, I mean, just for our viewers' sake, So, in a scenario where, you're talking about a lot of people having a majority of, the wealth, say, in a country, you don't view that as morally wrong.
No, I'm much more concerned with like meritocracy. Like you,
Hmm.
I kind of see the world much more like, this is going to make me sound a little bit woo, but like much more of a like karma perspective. Like you kind of get what you deserve. Like not
Sure.
necessarily like on a spiritual level, but like,
Hmm.
like if you put in the work and you're creating value for society, like you deserve kind of to get something out of that. Um,
Yeah.
I do get concerned, and I think this is probably where I'm not a zero on this. I do have some inclinations toward this. Like I am concerned with like people cheating the system. I just think that a lot of the way that people view cheating the system is kind of blown out of proportion often when it comes to politics.
Mm.
But yeah, and like, I'll pull yours up on here because I'm curious to see what your
Yeah.
yeah.
So
See,
I'm
you're much
I'm
higher.
different from Kyle. Yeah, I'm much higher on the fairness. But I'm generally where most I guess kind of self-identified conservatives are at on the fairness scale. I think that the reason for that is not necessarily because I'm more I think that people shouldn't be treated based on their merit. But I think it's more that I'm concerned about helping everybody else out. So I'm very like I guess outward focused with my morality. So my kind of moral positioning is always like, how do we help the most people rise to their own potential? And so I think that bleeds over into kind of this fairness where I view that some actions lead to other people. Lead to roadblocks unfairly for other people to achieve what they want to achieve.
Yeah, and I think often when we have disagreements, because you and I debate quite a bit,
Yeah.
I think often when we have disagreements, it's often comes down to this. You have probably much more of a bleeding heart than I do about.
Yeah.
I would say probably more like in my view, they tend to be more minor issues because I think I'm much more concerned with like the oppression side of things rather than just like the inherent inequalities that exist. And
Hmm.
I think that has me more focused in one direction and you more focused on another direction often.
Hmm.
I think just the types of things that we tend to be
Yeah. And for our viewers, oops.
yeah.
That was something that was really interesting that was talked about in The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt, is this idea that liberals and conservatives in this kind of like polarized political environment end up talking past each other because, generally speaking, liberals are mainly focused on fairness and care harm foundations. And so, when they're talking about, it's not fair, conservatives they're not even understanding what they're talking about because conservatives view things from many more different moral foundations. So conservatives could be speaking to a sense of patriotism, and a modern liberal may not even kind of understand where a conservative is coming at when they're saying that.
Well, and that's actually a good point because when you're looking at when you're looking at like the blue on here, like it's much more focused on just care, harm, and fairness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking at the red, it's much more straight across the board.
Yeah.
They kind of have much more a mixture of morality, and it doesn't mean that like liberal versus conservative, like one's more moral than the other. It's just kind of like
Right.
where they put their focus. Like liberals,
Yeah.
and this is the typical thing. Like you have the bleeding heart, like hippies. You have like the free love, like those types of movements, which is all about egalitarianism and causing the least amount of harm in the world. Well, conservatives tend to have a much more stronger consideration for authority, for loyalty, for patriotism,
Mm-hmm.
like
For sanctity.
yeah, like in-group preferences for sanctity, and then they have traditions which liberals tend to try to subvert traditions quite a bit, and they try to like do away with a lot of traditions. Well, conservatives are
Mm-hmm.
very much about like traditionalists maintaining
Right.
like maintaining traditions, like kind of keeping the norm in place because they've gotten
Right.
us here, like so like those are kind of distinct
Yeah.
characteristics of the two
Well,
camps.
and then the classic kind of moral case that liberals would make, against traditions is a result of their own moral foundation. So, liberals hold a high value on care harm, and so they say, well, if you're not hurting anybody and you're flouting a tradition, then there's no problem. It's morally okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then, conservatives would say, well, no, it's not, because there's a moral sentiment for them in tradition and upholding, kind of authoritative sentiments like that. So that's a really interesting kind of dynamic in our political state of our country. And we just thought it would be really interesting to introduce our viewers to this idea and this mindset, and then maybe, kind of go through some of the stereotypes that we're seeing throughout this pandemic and how they may apply to this scale.
Yeah, exactly. So do you want to get into the list that you sent me?
Sure. Yeah.
Cool.
Let's
yeah.
do
Now
it.
that we've kind of gone over that, here, let me get my thing back to normal. There we go.
Great.
Okay. So the first one on the list, you went with the meme, was the Karens.
Yeah.
And for those that don't understand this meme, this is the people that are calling the cops for their neighbors not social distancing, right? This is those types of people.
Yeah, and it's run into some controversy recently. Obviously people view it as a really negative stereotype that has, maybe some implications that might be damaging to, one group or another. But I think it's important for us to talk about, despite its negative connotation, because maybe we can help our viewers kind of understand where the Karens of the world are coming from a moral perspective. And that's really the benefit of moral foundations theory and Jonathan Haidt's kind of mindset in the righteous mind, where we're able to view people with drastically different opinions and maybe moral foundations than us, and understand where they're coming from a lot better. So yeah, let's okay, we've kind of talked about who the Karens are. So what's kind of their MO? I mean, I defined it as it's basically rule following, and where it gets negative and where people don't like it is this rule following is exploited to kind of virtue signal and to show that they're a morally upstanding person because they're following the rules, and they shame people who aren't.
Well, and I also think that I changed an aspect of this list where on the moral foundations, because I thought that the disgust and sanctity fitted a lot better on here. So I think authority and disgust sanctity were pretty clear foundations here, because you can just kind of envision somebody calling the cops because they're seeing someone playing with their kid in the park outside during quarantine, and just being like, like they just have that disgust, and they're just like, this person, they're not following the rules. and they're disgusted by those actions.
Well, and they feel that, it's so morally outrageous to them that they feel the need to do something about it.
And they've never heard of snitches get stitches,
Well, so I think that for people to understand where that comes from, it doesn't just come from a place of hatred or resentment towards other people. It comes from this moral respect for rules and authority and traditions. And so when rules come down from the government and from authority figures that say, stay at home, stay 6 feet apart, don't go outside more than once a day, then those people want to stick to that. And, kind of the where this goes negative is to when, those people want to use the rule following that they do as a way of showing they're morally superior.
Yeah, and you also put in this list of likely voted for.
I think that's really interesting.
Which I think is useful when we're looking at the Jonathan Haidt perspective, because it's in relation to people's politics. You said Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Michael Bloomberg were your picks on that.
Yeah.
Which I think makes sense, and I think really makes sense for Kamala Harris, because she's the cop, right? But a relevant topic that is around this. Did you see and this isn't the only time this has happened, but it kind of shows, what we're willing to do in some of these bigger cities. The guy that was playing catch with his kid in the park, I think it was in Philadelphia. I can't remember where it was, but a guy was playing catch with his kid in the park and got arrested. And later the police department apologized, because it turned out he was a cop. So they apologized, but this is the type of thing that's happening. And I think, and also like on top of that, the some of these cities, I know the mayor in LA, they're putting out like actual bounties, like they're putting out rewards for people that snitch on their neighbors for not social distancing properly. And you can get rewarded with money for this.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important to, clarify too. So where the Karens are the Karens, in that stereotype, people who fit in there, where they're coming from with this is not necessarily from, they're so concerned that, the actions of others are going to lead to, an uptick in the virus. They're more concerned about people aren't following the rules.
I think that's an important distinction, because like I know another one of these categories you have, it's much more about like another category is much more about the virus and the spread of it,
Right.
and talk and listening to the doctors and stuff. This is much more about just like the authority and the rules.
Right.
It's less about the virus. Like if it was a different crisis and the same type of stuff was happening, it'd be the same dynamic with the Karens. And liberty always dies with the Karens.
Yeah. And I hope that in this discussion, I hope that the people kind of get a better sense for where, a lot of these stereotypes, where their morality is coming from. And it's not just coming out of the blue. Respect for authority is a legitimate, moral foundation. It's a legitimate way of viewing the world. Sometimes it manifests in, kind of negative actions, and that's where we get this Karen stereotype, and this idea that that's a negative thing to be.
Well, and this is probably the most difficult one for me to wrap my brain around, because I'm so high in the liberty oppression standpoint, or in that matrix, where, because like, obviously this is just counter to that. Like you're getting the state involved and trying to get people like thrown, like get punished for
Right.
defying orders, and that's a really difficult one for me to wrap my brain around.
Yeah, that's right. And then I think a lot of people in just in general in the United States, being kind of a Western country and having that kind of Western view of morality that I was talking about earlier, a lot of people have a much higher focus on care or harm. And so, a lot of people's response to Karens are like, well, that guy pushing his child on a swing in a park isn't hurting anybody, or isn't actively trying to act negligently in order to infect other people with the virus. So he's not harming anybody. Therefore, he's not doing anything morally wrong, and we shouldn't stop it. But Karens, have a completely different moral foundation, and so they say, no, there's real moral problem here.
Yeah. So. Let's move on to the second one. The second one you labeled as the Keynesians, which is an economic viewpoint. Those people that don't know, John Maynard Keynes is a big name economist in the 20th century, and he largely, a lot of our economic models and what we do in the economy for the last 100 years about is largely because of John Maynard Keynes.
Right.
And it's very much about, in kind of a funny way, it's kind of about flattening the curve of economic ups and downs. It's kind of funny.
Wow, that's
it's very much like that. It's his model, which is like, we've actually gone probably way beyond his model. Like we're like kind of beyond Keynesianism at this point. Like I don't think Keynes in his wildest dreams would expect to see what we're seeing right now. But his model is very much like paying off debt when times are good, and going into debt when times are bad, to try to like flatten out the economic like surplus and shortages that happen. And so what we're seeing right now is times are bad, so you're having, got to print $6 trillion from the Fed.
Right.
It's kind of that model.
Yeah, the kind of Keynesian stereotype, at least what I had in mind when I was talking about this, is, this idea that government has a very active role in helping people through this virus situation, which, that's obviously something that's debated. And but I think that where this goes into a stereotype with the Keynesianism is this idea that at all costs, we have to make sure that businesses are running and that people are buying stuff.
Yeah,
And
emergency
that's
relief, and it's all about
yeah,
consumption. Like it's an economic
exactly
view that everything is based on consumption. So as long as things are people are buying things, then everything's great. Which is
right.
I think in a lot of ways counter to the economic perspective that we come through, which is that it's much more about the production side. Like you need to be producing,
And saving.
and saving.
Yeah.
Those things we probably have those in higher value. And
Right.
on the moral foundation side, we were like you left it blank, and I was kind of like fairness. Is it fairness? Because I feel like it's kind of you're trying to equalize a lot of things. In a lot of ways, it, it's perceived. It doesn't usually work this way in practice, but in a lot of ways, it's perceived that like the reason why these bailouts and the printing of the money, like all those things are justified to be able to help everybody up to like an even playing field when times are bad. And then when times are good, you're kind of like pushing the guys at the top down to try to also equalize. Like there's a lot of, I think, fairness that's there. And there's a lot of like very constrained rule sets that are kind of made in that argument.
Yeah. I would also say too, it really just comes from our Western culture's fundamental value of care harm. So it's this idea that like when there's a crisis, we have, government and leaders have an active role in reducing harm. And so I think that, the debate to be had there is, obviously what is the best actions to reduce harm. And right now the stereotype of a lot of these people that we see that we're calling the Keynesians is now we need to just pump money out into the economy. We need to get it into the hands of people and businesses at all costs, at the cost of our fiscal position as a country, at the cost of, potential hyperinflation and all that kind of stuff. So that's definitely where you're seeing it. And I think that the stereotype that, a lot of people who aren't really plugged into politics, where they'll see this is, I've seen a lot of people, criticizing government leaders for saying, I don't have my check yet and it hasn't come in the mail yet and that sort of thing. And, there's no concern for anything else besides getting this emergency, what they're calling relief to workers and small businesses.
And also, and I actually, because in the description that on the thing that you sent me, you put in quotes capitalists, which I think is a perfect way of describing this, because like we're capitalists, like you and I are capitalists, and we are very opposed to this economic worldview. But but when it comes down to it, like I think a lot of people, when they think of the word capitalist, they look at they're talking about this model. In a lot of ways, they're talking about a lot of the things that are going in like from the top, where you have like, because like all these bailouts coming through and this government this public private collusion and stuff like that's happening, is like we as I guess capitalists, like I think this an accurate way to describe ourselves until we find a better word maybe, is like we're very opposed to this view on an economic level.
Yeah, well, I think the difference there is that it's kind of an ends versus means kind of viewpoint. So some of these people who are Keynesians view the end result of what really is the end result of a healthy economy, at least on the surface level, is a lot of people spending money, businesses investing in new production, like all that kind of stuff. That they view that end result as the result that has to happen at all costs. That's where they have like the GDP model. Right. And then I think that people from our perspective who might be, viewing it differently, we view it as the means are very important there, and the means of saving and of producing are very important for producing a healthy economy in the long run. And an unhealthy economy might still have display symptoms of a healthy economy where they're spending and that sort of thing. But our concern is that it's not necessarily representative of what's going on underneath.
I was listening to a podcast like a month ago when all this stuff was just starting and a lot of the printing was going on, and Jeff Deist was being interviewed, and he's the president of the Mises Institute, Austrian economist who's kind of on the counter side of Keynesianism. And he was talking about like Yeah, at this point in time, like if you went to school and you studied monetary policy, like good luck. Monetary policy doesn't exist anymore. like we're on
Yeah.
like a whole nother era right now where it's just like we're just gonna keep printing and printing and printing, and we're just going to keep bailing out and bailing out. It doesn't even really like actual like monetary policy. Like there's no such thing at this point. Like nobody's paying attention to any of that, and I think that
Well,
these people are very much cheering that on.
so some people who are paying attention to that, our next category of our stereotypes here, which are
the
kind of
socialists.
the socialists, the democratic socialists. Yeah. It's interesting. One of the things I noted is, these are the folks who, are posting in social media right now that, hey, this $6 trillion could have paid for Medicare for all already.
Which actually, and I like that you put that in there when you sent this to me, because these are the Bernie Bros, like that you're like everyone knows the Bernie Bros, Bernie Sanders, and like I actually think like I disagree with it, but I think that they make a fair point. Like if we're willing to just print trillions of dollars for all this stuff, why aren't we funding all these social programs? Why is that, right? Like, I disagree with it. Like, I think that it's terrible for the economy to do this. But if we're to operate in this statist Keynesian mindset, it's like, yeah, why don't we have Medicare for all? Why isn't the government funding? Apparently, the Fed's just been hoarding money, right? Which obviously that's not the case. That's not how economics work. But like, I could see why somebody would have that perspective.
Yeah, it's understandable, and they make a good point. Crying, handouts to rich or wealthy corporations or big corporations and that sort of thing, and but in my view, in my personal view, they failed to see the repercussions of just handing out money to indiscriminately to everybody else too, because there's repercussions, for handouts to the rich and corporate welfare. There's also repercussions for handouts to everybody else too, as we're seeing where we're hearing stories where people are unwilling to go back to work because they're making more on unemployment.
Well, and also like when you get it down to like the philosophical, logical conclusions of them, like there's a lot of Marxist thought in here, and the Marxists don't believe in money. They don't believe in prices. Like when it comes down to it, is like I think when you take it to the extreme conclusions, like money's just not a factor in this mindset. It's all pure egalitarianism. Like
so that's their moral. That's their moral
fairness.
Foundation. Yeah, that's the big moral foundation that the Bernie Bros are operating off of. It's this idea that like if the government is to hand out money, it has to be for the people who have the least. It has to be a redistribution, and they view some people as having more than others as a really a morally bad thing.
Yeah, wealth should be equalized. Like we're all in this together. We're sharing everything. Like that's the general mindset of it. But like also that being said, I disagree with their economics, but I think that they make some fair points. Like some of these guys, at least they're criticizing a lot of the bailouts that are happening. Like I disagree with the bailouts as well. So like I agree with them there. It's just, man, their economics are just so bad though. I understand the fairness, trying to equalize everything. I like on my moral foundations, I kind of think it's a fool's errand. But
Well, yeah, and I think they differ from Keynesians probably in maybe the loyalty or the traditionalism foundation, because I think the Keynesians are unwilling to pursue a brand new social program like Medicare for all, because it's not really something that's traditionally the role of the government. And so they would push back on that, but they would say that, but we have to get money to hospitals and people right now.
Well, and I think the Keynesians these would probably be like the more managerial state types, like the Joe Bidens, the Mitt Romneys, like the John Kerrys, the Hillary Clintons, that's kind of like those people, right? Like they're the ones that, and these are the people like they're very happy with managing the economy. Like they kind of take some elements of capitalism and they take some elements of socialism and kind of push them all together.
Right. Exactly. But they're unwilling to entertain ideas of, the socialists, because they don't have such a large focus on fairness. They're just more concerned about kind of maintaining, kind of how things are, maintaining the status quo across, kind of all all the economy. And so that I think goes into the loyalty and kind of maybe even the authority and traditionalism, foundation. So.
Well, yeah, and I think that this is the classic. Like, if we're to put it to the extremes of what both camps believe, like this is the dynamics of fascism versus communism. Like,
Well, I would say
if you were to push them to their extremes, like right now we're not fully there, but like those two camps are kind of like lesser versions of those.
Well, I think if you want to talk about, the extreme of the authority matrix, I think we got to talk about our next stereotype, which is what I called the armchair epidemiologist. And I think everybody who has been on social media has seen a lot of this, where you have folks who all of a sudden, they're not medical experts, but all of a sudden they know exactly how this virus is going to behave and how we can flatten the curve. And a lot of different opinions that I don't necessarily think they're qualified for.
Yeah, well, and when it comes down to it, a lot of the stuff when it comes to this virus are like we have missing data points. Like we don't have all the information right now. We don't know every single variable that goes into it. But there's a lot of people that kind of like to think that we do.
Right.
And they're operating. I put in parentheses next to this on your thing the technocrats, because I think that there's a big surgence of this technocratic identity that's popping up, and I think that we saw that with Andrew Yang. Who you put as the most likely voted for this category, where it's the people that. What's the best way to describe this?
I would describe it as
Go ahead.
Yeah, they think. I mean, I think that kind of their catchphrase that we put on here sums it up. I mean, they think that we should listen to the experts, and while I personally think that that's certainly a fair view. Experts
take the medical advice. Yeah, like you should
take medical advice exactly. Yeah. But it's not. But it's I think where technocracy and kind of this stereotype that we're talking about. The way that they turn it into kind of a negative stereotype is, they unquestionably and undoubtedly say, listen to the experts. And kind of the part there that's wrong is that, not all experts are correct.
Well, and they deify this. Like, and when we're talking about moral foundations, is like, that's what Jonathan Haidt's talking about, is like people have a religious mentality towards this stuff. So the technocrats, they deify the scientific elite, right? I personally I agree to an extent. Like, you should heed the wisdom of people that are specialized in their fields, because they probably know more about the field than you're talking about. But when it comes down to it, is that there's no such thing as perfect knowledge. Like, nobody has perfect knowledge. And coming from the Austrian school of thought, like both of us do, F.A. Hayek, Nobel Prize winner, he's somebody that is very good on this subject, where he talks about what he calls the knowledge problem, or the economic calculation problem, where it's impossible when we're talking about these super complex systems to be able to narrow everything down to small little variables that you can manipulate, because there's so much going on. Like, it's like you can't possibly just like manage every single little avenue. And a lot of these people think that, with perfect technology, we're going to get there, and we're going to have this like utopian vision of society where everything's super calculated and neat and nice.
As long as there's an expert in charge, So like if a doctor was president, then, everything would be different. And kind of our perspective, as being people who probably agree a lot with F.A. Hayek. I think what we would say is that, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't matter who's in a public office. They have imperfect knowledge and are acting on incentives. And therefore, not necessarily the results that you would think a professional or an expert would make would be what happens. Even if we do have an expert in charge, they still, number one, have imperfect knowledge, and number two, are acting on political and just in general incentives. And so they're not necessarily going to make the perfect decision based upon their expertise. And that's kind of where, that's a criticism of this point of view, and kind of where it goes negative.
Well, and I was talking about this with a mutual friend of ours. I was talking about the whole Hayek thing, and just being like, when it comes to like, I think that Hayek's talk of scientism and the economic calculation problem has much less to do. Sorry, That's not the way to describe it. It's not just about economics. It's also kind of a lifestyle in a lot of ways, where it's just kind of taking a humbleness and a recognition of like, we don't have perfect knowledge and we need to be aware of that, and that should be part of our decision making, and understanding that we don't have that. And a lot of my qualms with the people in this camp, although I agree, like, listen to people that are specialized in their fields because they're going to have more knowledge, but like also have that degree of humbleness of like, we don't know everything about the world. Like,
well, so that's I think that's really important, and I think it's why it's helpful analyzing this through a moral foundations lens, because these technocrats, the way that they kind of view morality is through kind of the authority lens. And that has the potential to turn negative sometimes, because the way that they signal to others that they are morally superior or morally sanctified is they say, listen to authority and don't question it. So they're not necessarily coming at something from a like a negative or a harmful line of thought where they're trying to force upon others authority or something like that, or I don't know, but from a negative standpoint, they're honestly trying to do good and do moral good from their point of view is to listen to the experts and to put experts in charge and don't question what they say.
Well, and that's kind of the thing with a lot of these stuff is like a lot of the moral foundations, like they're very subjective. Like it's a subjective view of the world. I do think that there is like objective reality to consider, and that like some of these approaches may be wrong in given circumstances and yada yada yada. But like there is an important understanding of like a lot of these people, like whether or not they're living to what I think is objective reality or not. Like a lot of these people, like they are like most of these people are not necessarily bad actors.
Right.
Like it's just that we have fundamental disagreements on how some of these approaches are made.
Right.
And often a lot of these different approaches, there's some merit and some wisdom that can be taken from all these different approaches.
Sure.
When we're viewing the world.
Yeah, but I think that the reason why these are stereotypes is because they are so starkly different in their focus on moral foundations.
Exactly. Yeah. I agree. Well, and then kind of the counter to this one is probably the extreme side in the other direction. We weren't exactly sure what to call this, but we're kind of calling it denialists for like the extreme version of it, where what you describe this. It's your list.
Sure. So the denialists, at least in my view, I think probably have a very, very low focus on authority as a moral foundation. And what they probably have very high is a focus on loyalty, so a sense of patriotism and sense of in-group loyalty. And then they probably have a high view of well, I guess what would you say, Kyle? What's the other one there?
I think the liberty oppression thing is
right.
is useful in here, because I think a lot of it is you have a lot of the narrative, and I mean this is kind of a general stereotype on like the fake news stuff. Like I think that there are some merits to this category in the way that they approach things, because I think skepticism is useful. I think some people go into too far of extremes with their skepticism.
Right.
But like this is a lot of probably the extreme versions would be saying that this doesn't even exist, and that it's all hype so that all these other things are happening. But like the lesser versions of that are probably more so like taking into account like we don't know whether or not Corona came from bat soup in Wuhan, and but like and then the president plays into the stereotype quite a bit, because when he's calling it like the China virus, and like there's a lot of things that go on with that there.
I think the kind of dynamic at play is that it really is such a low view of the authority moral foundation, and I think what that means is that they actually view authority figures and experts as outside of their group, as people who are counter or opposed to their group and what they're trying to accomplish morally. And so when an expert or an authority figure or somebody, in the government or something like that says, hey, we need to do something, or we need to do this, or this is how it is, they automatically view it with denial and skepticism, because they're trying to protect their own in-group. And so that's where you have, people who are, actively not politically correct, and so they call it the China virus or something like that, or they're actively saying or promoting alternative medicines that the experts aren't talking about because there's some conspiracy against this word getting out. I think that from a moral foundations perspective, that's what's underlying there. And as with all of these stereotypes, it's not necessarily wrong, and it's not necessarily morally incorrect. It's just that's how these folks view morality. They have a very skeptical view of authority.
Yeah, and skepticism's healthy, but it also can be unhealthy. Like, skepticism is a tool, right? And this is very much a counter to the technocratic, because a lot of, I think a lot of the technocratic mindset people, like, they would be very comfortable in just having like a council of bureaucratic scientists that kind of lead the country, right? Well, then this camp here would be like that would terrify them. Like,
right. They'd be like, let's have a council of welders and auto workers.
Which sounds all right. Better than lawyers, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, I just think that's such a diametrically opposed, two groups. And it's really interesting because it's not necessarily just because they disagree on politics or because they're Democrat or Republican. It's because they view morality differently.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. Well, and also I think a relevant topic on this is the World Health Organization and all the drama that's been going on there. I haven't been paying too close attention to it. There's a lot of like China corruption and stuff like that that's going on there. And this is probably the topic that these types of people are most focused on. Like, this is like their key issue during this time, I would say, is like this type of thing. Yeah, and then number 6, which I think very clearly me. I feel like you almost had me in mind with number 6 with our final one.
Sure.
Is the contrarian libertarians. Which, and I think, because my mindset during this whole thing is like, I haven't been necessarily as concerned with the virus itself. I've been much more concerned with the economic side of this and everything that's been going on the economy. And when I'm talking with people, that's usually much more at the forefront of my perspective. When I'm tweeting and rambling on Twitter and stuff like that, this is the stuff that I'm talking about. I'm not as concerned, like because epidemiology, not my thing. I don't know much about it. But I'm pretty well studied when it comes to economics, so I'm much more concerned with possible economic downturn, depending on with how policy is interacting. And I think that the contrarian libertarians are typically more so concerned with that type of stuff right now.
Yeah, well, and from a moral foundation standpoint, you have a high concern for care harm. So you're concerned with
maybe I don't know if that would suit me, but to some it might.
Yes, and then obviously a very high sensitivity to liberty and oppression,
and that's my key thing. Like, I'm much more concerned with like us going into a police state than anything else.
Right. Yeah. Well,
which is why I'm opposed to the Karens, right?
Yeah. Exactly. I think, what I hope for readers who pursue, or not readers, but viewers who, pursue moral foundations theory and maybe read up on it after this podcast. My hope is that, that we all kind of collectively realize that there's a middle ground to track here, and that, we shouldn't let our kind of underlying psychologies, lead us into a biased position. Or a biased moral positioning in this pandemic environment. That we can reasonably say that experts should be listened to some extent, and we can also reasonably say that let's have a dialogue about issues and talk about what's wrong and what's right about different reports and different actions that the government takes and that sort of thing.
So I have a question for you, because I'm not sure I agree with there's a middle ground on everything statement. and it might not, what I'm catching from it might not be your intent, so I'd be curious for you to
Okay.
expand on it. But the way that sounds to me is that there's kind of like, and I think this is like a very Rousseauian view. Like this is something that Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a philosopher, talked about, which I disagree with, is that he talks about the general will of things, which is kind of like the sum total of all wills coming together, and that's like the collective will of people. And that's kind of what I'm getting from this. Like there's a middle ground on everything, because I'm not necessarily sure that's true. Like I do think that there's like objective reality of like you know, like there are certain avenues that are better than others. It's just people have different subjective standards, but people's subjective standards, it's not the same as objective reality. You know what I mean? Like, if that makes sense. I might be butchering that, but
Yeah, I guess I see what you're saying. I don't think that necessarily is a proper way of kind of characterizing my views.
okay.
Maybe just to re-put it, I think that I think you said it well, where there is a right path to take. So there is a truth that we can discern about how government should react to the virus, about how people should react, and that sort of thing. There's subjective ways to get there, obviously, because we come at things subjectively in a biased position from our moral foundations.
And a lot of it is us trying to find the truth, right? Like a lot of us,
right.
Like we're just trying to figure it out as well.
Right. And so what I was saying, in the sense of, trying to track a middle ground, is this idea of, try and lead, this, Jonathan Haidt talks about this.
Do you mean more like a middle ground on understanding, like understanding people?
Yeah. So when we're trying to pursue truth and the right path to take in all this chaos, I think that it's important for us to not rely on our moral and to be aware of the biases it creates with us and with other people, and to rationally, look at all the facts and think about all of the consequences, and try and find that path of truth. And I think Jonathan Haidt, he talks about this in the very beginning of The Righteous Mind. I think it's just such a great way of looking at things. He says that people, the way that people's minds work is if you think of it like a rider on an elephant, and an animal, and it's going to go wherever it wants to go, at the end of the day. But a rider can, direct the elephant to some extent. And so he thinks, Jonathan Haidt posits that, kind of our minds work a very similar way, where the elephants are kind of our moral foundations and our psychology and our personalities and things like that, the way that we're kind of geared to work. And then our rationality is kind of like the rider, where we can be aware of that morality that we have deeply seated in us, and try and use different data points and facts that we pick up to characterize like what our next move may be and what the truth is.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And a lot of people aren't aware that a lot of their actions are determined by the elephant, and that they haven't, them as a rider has not necessarily maintained mastery over control of riding their elephant.
Right.
And that takes practice in a lot of ways. And this is, I think, like when you're in a debate with somebody or something like that, and you guys are kind of just like talking past each other, and like one person or both people are getting like overly emotional because of something. That's their elephant taking control. Their elephant's going on a rampage.
Here's a great example of that. The visual that I'm sure a lot of our viewers saw in the past few weeks of, the nurse standing at the crosswalk, blocking this car, and a Karen, or I don't think it was a Karen, I guess, but it would be one of those denialists getting out of her car with a sign and shouting down this person. I don't think that that's the right state for our country to be in. I think there's a better way for us to interact with each other if we can only be aware of the moral foundations and the differences that we have. Yes. I think we can kind of transcend that.
Well, and that's exactly it. One of my favorite memes, I saw this like a day or two ago, but it came out of its kind of it's poking fun at the deification of the of like the medical experts and the elites and stuff like that, and doctors and stuff like that. It's poking fun at kind of this like religious mindset that a lot of people have, where I saw like walking down a hallway, you have like 3 doctors, and on both sides of the hallway is like DC comic heroes and Marvel comic heroes, like all like saluting to them as the nurses are going down the hallway. It's amazing.
Well, yeah, but you know, I think that this hopefully was informative for our viewers. And this is just, like I said, when I read The Righteous Mind and I became aware of moral foundations theory, it really changed up how I go about politics, and I view political differences between people. So I hope that it, you know, helps other people too, and especially navigate this chaotic time where everyone's kind of taking different sides and falling into one stereotype or the other.
Yeah, and I completely agree, and I hope that we keep having conversations that are kind of more in the realm of psychology, because this is probably one of my favorite fields of interest that I think doesn't get enough attention as it should when it comes to looking at like political situations, economics, stuff like that. I think that psychology is a very useful tool for having a good understanding of how, you know, just individuals operate. With that, like, thank you for making this list, because it gave me a good laugh, and I think it was a good topic to go over, as we both love this moral foundations theory and Jonathan Haidt's work. And when I go through and kind of edit this thing up, I'll put links down in the description for taking the moral foundations quiz so that you can see and kind of compare yourselves to me and Kendall, and also probably put a link to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, as it's, out of nonfiction literature, it's probably one of my favorite reads I've had in several years. Very worth the time and very useful for understanding the world. But with that, we're at our hour mark. Do you have any last words that you want to say, Kendall, before we kind of finalize this thing?
I'll say this: stay rational, but also stay optimistic.
Which is directly from another great book, The Rational Optimist by Matt Ridley. All right, awesome. Well, thank you, man. It's been great chatting to you. Stay safe, stay healthy. Like, comment, subscribe. We're still kicking this podcast thing off. And with that, this has been Acadian Driftwood. Thank you, guys.